1744, 35. Etat 35. Does that mean he was 35 when he wrote this? I don't know what Etat 35 means. But the year is 1744. It does not appear that he wrote anything in 1744 for the Gentleman's Magazine, but the preface. His Life of Baratier was now republished in a pamphlet by itself. But he produced one work this year, fully sufficient to maintain the high reputation which he had acquired. This was The Life of Richard Savage, a man of whom it is difficult to speak impartially without wondering that he was for some time the intimate companion of Johnson. For his character was marked by profligacy, insolence, and ingratitude. Yet, as he undoubtedly had a warm and vigorous, though unregulated mind, had seen life in all its variants, and had been much in the company of the statesmen and wits of his time, he could communicate to Johnson an abundant supply of such materials as his philosophical curiosity most eagerly desired. And as Savage's misfortunes and misconduct had reduced him to the lowest state of wretchedness as a writer for bread, his visits to St. John's Gate naturally brought Johnson and him together. Some footnotes here. As a specimen of Savage's temper, I insert the following letter from him to a noble lord, Lord Tydecuddle, Croker, to whom he was under great obligation, but who, on account of his bad conduct, was obliged to discard him. The original was in the hands of the late Francis Cockayne, Esquire, one of His Majesty's council learned in the law. Here's a good letter for you. Right honorable brute and booby. That's good. I find you want, as Mr. Blank is pleased to hint, to swear away my life, that is, the life of your creditor, because he asks you for a debt. The public shall soon be acquainted with this, to judge whether you are now fitted to be an Irish evidence than to be an Irish peer. I defy and despise you. I am your determined adversary, R.S. That's pretty good. Sir John Hawkins gives the world to understand that Johnson, being an admirer of genteel manners, was captivated by the address and demeanour of Savage, who, as to his exterior, was, to a remarkable degree, accomplished. Hawkins's Life, page 52, says this. But Sir John's notions of gentility must appear somewhat ludicrous from his stating the following circumstance as presumptive evidence that Savage was a good swordsman. That he understood the exercise of a gentleman's weapon may be inferred from the use made of it in that rash encounter which it related in his life. The dexterity here alluded to was that Savage, in a nocturnal fit of drunkenness, stabbed a man at a coffee-house and killed him, for which he was tried at the Old Bailey and found guilty of murder. Johnson indeed describes him as having a grave and manly deportment, a solemn dignity of mien, by which, upon a near acquaintance, softened into an engaging easiness of manners. How highly Johnson admired him for that knowledge which he himself so much cultivated, and what kindness he entertained for him, appears from the following lines in the Gentleman's Magazine from April 1738, which I am assured were written by Johnson. Ad Richterum Savage, humanae stadium generis Q pictore fervet, o collet humanitam te faticu genius. May the human race cherish him, in whose breast burns the love of humankind. Here's another footnote that was within a footnote, I believe. The following striking proof of Johnson's extreme indignance when he published The Life of Savage was communicated to the author by Mr. Richard Stowe of Applesley in Bedfordshire, from the information of Mr. Walter Hart, author of The Life of Gustavus Adolphus. Soon after Savage's life was published, Mr. Hart dined with Edward Cave and occasionally praised it. Soon after meeting him, Cave said, "You made a man very happy the other day." How could that be? Said Hart. Nobody was there but ourselves. Cave answered by reminding him that a plate of victuals was sent behind a screen, which was to Johnson, dressed so shabbily that he did not choose to appear, but on hearing the conversation was highly delighted with the encomiums of his book. I think we can safely move on to the next page now. It's like the book itself is a boss, and those footnotes are sub bosses. Or maybe the footnotes are bosses, and the footnotes are sub bosses. I don't know. I'm getting lost here. It is melancholy to reflect that Johnson and Savage were sometimes in such extreme indignance that they could not pay for a lodging, so that they have wandered together whole nights in the streets. Yet, in these almost incredible scenes of distress, we must suppose that Savage mentioned many of the anecdotes with which Johnson afterwards enriched the life of his unhappy companion and those of other poets. He told Sir Joshua Reynolds that one night in particular, when Savage and he walked round St. James's Square for want of a lodging, they were not at all depressed by their situation, but in high spirits and brimful of patriotism, traversed the square for several hours, inveighed against the minister, and resolved they would stand by their country. I am afraid, however, that by associating with Savage, who was habituated to the dissipation and licentiousness of the town, Johnson, though his good principles remained steady, did not entirely preserve that conduct for which, in days of greater simplicity, he was remarked by his friend Mr. Hector, but was imperceptibly led into some indulgencies which occasioned much distress to his virtuous mind. I wonder if he's talking about brothels. That Johnson was anxious that an authentic and favorable account of his extraordinary friend should first get possession of the public attention is evidence from a letter which he wrote in the Gentleman's Magazine for August of the year preceding its publication. And no, it's not to Mr. Cave this time, it's to Mr. Urban. Mr. Urban, as your collections show how often you have owed the ornaments of your poetical pages to the correspondence of the unfortunate and ingenious Mr. Savage, I doubt, but not you have so much regard to his memory as to encourage my design that may have a tendency to the preservation of it from insults or calumnies. And therefore, with some degree of assurance, entreat you to inform the public that his life will speedily be published by a person who is favored with his confidence, and receive from himself an account of most of the transactions which he proposes to mention, to the time of his retirement to Swansea and Wales. From that period to his death in the prison of Bristol, the account will be continued from materials still less liable to objection, his own letters, and those of his friends, some of which will be inserted in the work, and abstracts of others subjoined in the margin. It may be reasonably imagined that others may have the same design, but as it is not credible that they can obtain the same materials, it must be expected that they will supply from invention the wants of intelligence, and that under the title of The Life of Savage, they will publish only a novel filled with romantic adventures and imaginary amours. You may, therefore, perhaps gratify the lovers of truth and wit by giving me leave to inform them in your magazine that my account will be published in 8 volumes by Mr. Roberts in Warwick Lane. No signature. In February 1744, accordingly came forth from the shop of Roberts, between whom and Johnson I have not traced any connection, except the casual one of this publication. In Johnson's Life of Savage, although it must be allowed that its moral is the reverse of Receptior Exemplar Vitae Moronque Hublot, which is quoted as from Horace's Poetica as I advise him to take as his model real life and manners. A very useful lesson is calculated to guard men of warm passions from a too free indulgence of them. And the various incidences are related in so clear and animated a manner, and illuminated through with so much philosophy, that it is one of the most interesting narratives in the English language. Wow. Sir Joshua Reynolds told me that upon his return from Italy, he met with it in Devonshire, knowing nothing of its author, and began to read it while he was standing with his arms leaning against a chimney-piece. It seized his attention so strongly that, not being able to lay down the book till he had finished it, when he attempted to move, he found his arm totally benumbed. The rapidity with which this work was composed is a wonderful circumstance. Johnson has been heard to say, I wrote 48 of the printed octavo pages of the Life of Savage at a sitting, but then I sat up all night. That's from the Journal of the Hebrides. Plug. He exhibits the genius of Savage to the best advantage in the specimens of his poetry which he has selected, some of which are of uncommon merit. We, indeed, occasionally find such a vigor and such point as might make us suppose that the generous aid of Johnson had been imparted to his friend. Mr. Thomas Warton made this remark to me, and in support of it quoted from the poem entitled The Bastard, a line in which the fancied superiority of one stamped in nature's mint with ecstasy is contrasted with a regular lawful descendant of some great and ancient family. No 10th transmitter of a foolish face. But the fact is that this poem was published some years before Johnson and Savage were acquainted. It is remarkable that in this biographical disquisition there appears a very strong symptom of Johnson's prejudice against players. A prejudice which may be attributed to the following causes. First, the imperfection of his organs, which were so defective that he was not susceptible of the fine impressions which theatrical excellence produces upon the generality of mankind. Second, the cold rejection of his tragedy. And lastly, the brilliant success of Garrick, who had been his pupil, who had come to London at the same time with him, not in a much more prosperous state than himself, and whose talents he undoubtedly rated low compared with his own. His being outstripped by his pupil in the race of immediate fame, as well as of fortune, probably made him feel some indignation, as thinking that whatever might be Garrick's merits in his art, the reward was too great when compared with what the most successful efforts of literary labor could obtain. At all periods of his life, Johnson used to talk contemptuously of players. Here I think he's talking about actors, not, ladies' men. But in this work he speaks of them with peculiar acrimony, for which perhaps there were formerly too much reason from the licentious and dissolute manners of those engaged in that profession. It is but justice to add that in our own time such a change has taken place, that there is no longer room for such an unfavorable distinction. Thank God. His schoolfellow and friend, Dr. Taylor, told me a pleasant anecdote of Johnson triumphing over his pupil, David Garrick. Can't wait for this one. When that great actor had played some little time at Goodman's Fields, Johnson and Taylor went to see him perform, and afterwards passed the evening at a tavern with him and old Gifford. Johnson, who was ever depreciating stage players, after censuring some mistakes in emphasis which Garrick had committed in the course of that night's acting, said, "The players, sir, have got a kind of rant with which they run on without any regard either to accent or emphasis." Both Garrick and Gifford were offended at this sarcasm, and endeavored to refute it, Upon which Johnson rejoined, "Well now, I'll give you something to speak, with which you are little acquainted, and then we shall see how just my observation is. That shall be the criterion. Let me hear you repeat the 9th commandment. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." "Both tried it." "At it," said Dr. Taylor, and both mistook the emphasis, which should be upon not and false witness. Johnson put them right and enjoyed his victory with great glee. I suspect Dr. Taylor was inaccurate in this statement. The emphasis should be equally upon shalt and not, as both concur to form the negative injunction, and false witness, like the other acts prohibited in the Decalogue, should not be marked by any peculiar emphasis, but only be distinctly enunciated. Anyway, Johnson's Life of Savage was no sooner published than the following liberal praise was given to it in the Champion, a periodical paper. "This pamphlet is, without flattery to its author, as just and well-written a piece as of its kind I ever saw, so that at the same time that it highly deserves, it certainly stands very little in need of this recommendation. As to the history of this unfortunate person whose memoirs compose this work, it is certainly penned with equally accurate in spirit, of which I am so much the better to judge, as I know many of the facts mentioned to be strictly true, and fairly related. Besides, it is not only the story of Mr. Savage, but innumerable incidents relating to other persons and other affairs, which renders this a very amusing and, withal, a very instructive and valuable performance. The author's observations are short, significant, and just, as his narrative is remarkably smooth and well disposed. His reflections are open to all the recesses of the human heart. And, in a word, a more just or pleasant, a more engaging, or a more improving treatise on all the excellencies and defects of human nature, it is scarce to be found in our, or perhaps in any language. This character of the Life of Savage is not written by Fielding, or as has been supposed, but most probably by Ralph, who, as appears from the minutes of the partners of the Champion, in the possession of Mr. Reed of Staple Inn, succeeded Fielding in his share of the paper before the date of this eulogium. Johnson's partiality for Savage made him entertain no doubt of his story, however extraordinary and improbable. Made him entertain. It's not a term we use anymore. Entertained him, for no doubt, for his story. It never occurred to him to question his being the son of the Countess of Maxensfield, of whose unrelenting barbarity he so loudly complained, and the particulars of which are related in so strong and affecting a manner in Johnson's life of him. Johnson was certainly well warranted in publishing his narrative, however offensive it might be to the lady and her relations, because her alleged unnatural and cruel conduct to her son, and shameful avowal of guilt, were stated in the Life of Savage now lying before me, which came out so early as 1727. And no attempt had been made to confute it, or to punish the author or printer as a libeller. But, for the honor of human nature, we should be glad to find the shocking tale not true, and from a respectable gentleman connected with the lady's family. I have received such information or remarks, as joined to my own inquiries will, I think, render it at least somewhat doubtful, especially when we consider that it must have originated from the person himself who went by the name of Richard Savage. And that source was the late Francis Cockayne Cust, Esquire, one of His Majesty's council. I think I'll stop there. Oh, that's getting good, huh? It's really getting good now. Moving along. His life's moving along. Well, until next time, bye from Boswell.